and welcome to Hop Along Studio. In today's video, I want to share with you a bit of a buyer's guide for how to buy watercolor markers and pens. There's so many different brands available out on the market, and it can be confusing to know sometimes where to start, what to look for, and what's really the difference between the more craft markers versus the art markers. So let's get started. So I'm going to show you 4 different pens today. I have the very basic Crayola fine liner pen. I have the Marvy Le Plume 2 dual brush pen. I also have these Tombow dual brush pens as well. And then lastly, the Marabou Aqua Pen Graphics, that's also a dual brush pen. So let's first talk about these Crayola pens. Basically, they are a typical Crayola one that you can get really anywhere. These ones are a fine tip. So again, you can get a very fine line. That's about as thick of a line as you can get with them if you use the side of the pen, but they are meant more just for writing. And that's fine, they work quite well. The color isn't bad with these. Again, they're quite vibrant. The difference between the more expensive markers and the less expensive markers is often the quality of the dye ink inside of them. So even though these ones are working fairly well, they won't be nearly as light fast or as nice of a blend as you might find with a more higher end marker. I also have these Marvy Le Plume markers. I bought these probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And these ones have both a brush nib and they also have a very fine writing tip. And this one's quite fine, which is really quite nice because it has such a fine tip that works quite well for writing, but it also works well for the brushwork side of things. To be honest, most of my other ones of this type have died, so I wouldn't say that they are my first choice just because of the fact that they haven't lasted very long, considering that I only bought them about 5 years ago. The other pens I have are my Tombow pens, and these ones, some of them I have owned for more than 10 years, probably closer to 12 or 15 actually. And so these pens are also a dual brush pen, and they come with, again, that brush tip that is quite thick, and they also come with a more fine nib. This fine nib is not nearly as fine as the Marvy, but it has a little bit more of a feeling like the Crayola nib. And these pens, because I live in a semi-arid climate and it's extremely dry here, the fact that these pens have lasted more than 10 years shows us how well the caps work on them, the quality of the ink, and just the quality of these pens. And lastly, we have the Aqua Pen Graphics, which are one of my new favorites. And these ones also have a brush tip and a fine tip. And you can see every fine tip is a little bit different. This one's probably the finest, then probably this one, and then these ones. So every one, even though they're dual brush pens, don't always write the same. These ones I particularly like for just the feel of the barrel and just how they write as well. So when we're talking about colors, these pens come in a range of colors. There's 107 colors for the dual brush markers, but then they also have a blender pen, which brings them to 108. The Marvy ones come in 108 colors as well, so they have a very large range of color. The Crayolas basically come in the standard colors that Crayola makes, which is a very limited palette. And then these Aqua Pen Graphics only come in 24 colors. But I'm okay with that. I wouldn't necessarily buy 108 colors of pens. So for example here, I actually have a color chart that Tombow has available on their website, and I've added in all the colors that I actually own of the Tombow pens. And so what I find is sometimes when you're buying the Tombows in sets, you end up with more colors on one side of the color wheel or the other, which is why I end up having so many reds and oranges and less of the yellows and the purples. And that's part of the reason why you might want to go to your local art store and buy the pens individually, maybe to fill in some of those gaps. But for me, the idea of using 108 colors is almost a little bit overwhelming. But I've been finding that just having 24 colors to work with is lots for me. So I'd like to start talking about the blendability of these colors and also some of the things to consider when you are buying a pen. So in this case, we've already talked about how it has a finer line, and if you put it on the side, you can get a deeper line. But then let's see how these work with water. And I'm just using a water brush just to really simplify this process. I wanted something I could put a lot of water down quite quickly. And because I'm using watercolor paper, this makes the blending process very easy. So these ones are quite water soluble. They give you quite a lot of color difference as you blend them out. So now we're going to move on to the Tombows, and these ones also have a very vibrant blend. So you can see that they do mix very well with color, and you can pull that color quite a ways just to get a really soft, really nice blend. Then I'm going to pull out one of the graphics ones as well. I know I'm not using all the same colors, but I just wanted to use a deep color so you can see the difference. And again, by adding a lot of water, you can get a nice blend. So there's a few differences though when you are adding water to these. These all look like they have smooth blends, but you might notice that the graphics has a little bit more of an edge. And that's one thing that I actually like about these ones. For example, if I want to do some sort of shape and maybe I just want to add a very subtle blend. I don't want to lose all of the edges. I just want to have a little bit of blending going on. This is where being able to have a pen that keeps kind of the outside shape and works a bit more like a pen works a little bit better for some of the style that I like to draw in. And especially when you're doing urban sketching and things like that, this is a really nice thing to be able to add in color, but still keep that edge. The Tombows, on the other hand, they will blend even more. So basically when you're blending this, you lose the entire edge of it. You actually can lose the edge altogether. And so it's great because it's very water soluble. But then if you're looking to have a more of a stronger line, the problem with that is you end up losing some of the strength of that line if that's what you're hoping for. Yeah, because if I go crazy with this, it pretty much disappears. If I do the same thing to this one, I'm adding a lot of water on here. It's still keeping that edge. You can see even with the blend here, you can see where my line ended and then it blended out from there. So depending on what you're looking to do with this, that affects what you maybe want to look for. And even with this Crayola ones, you can see where there's a little bit of feathering there by adding a lot of water. The Tombows take the water a little bit better than the Crayolas and give you a little bit finer finish with that. But just for sake of argument, the Crayolas do the same thing. They pretty much, you lose the line completely. If you want to use these in place of watercolor paints, you may want something like a Tombow or the Crayola that has basically the ability to blend to almost nothing. If you want a little bit stronger edge, like I like to do because I sketch and draw and do other things with it, you may want to have something like the graphics that have a little bit more of that solid line that is left in place. So what's nice about the Crayolas or a lot of these fine liner ones is that you end up being able to use it like a regular pen. Any of the writing sides of any of these dual tip pens work this way, and it's great. So with the Crayolas, because they only really do the fine liner, it's really one pen that only does one thing. The Tombows, on the other hand, a lot of people use these ones for calligraphy. And what's nice about them for calligraphy is because of the way the tips are, you can go very fine and you can put a huge amount of pressure down. And you can go up fine and put tons of pressure down. Again, I don't do calligraphy, but this is one thing that I know about them that people do love. And because of the way the tip is, it does bounce back fairly well from this. But it's for doing really large letters. And what I find is because it is quite bendy, hard to see on camera, but I'm actually bending that tip at a very sharp angle. What I find is if you are not super controlled and you don't have a lot of experience with pens, you may find trying to control this really quite difficult. But they're a very good pen and I've been using them for more than 10 years, so I'm very happy with them. So part of the reason I'm using my graphics pens more is I like the brush nib on this one a little bit more. It has a little less bend compared to the other one, and so you're not getting nearly as much bend to it, which again, you can still get some of these shapes in, but for me, being a little less controlled, I can control it a little bit more because it has a little less bend. I really like the fact that Tombow has a nice bend to the pen, but if you have less control, it's nice being able to have something you can control a bit more. And I find you can make smaller shapes because of it, just because I have a little bit more control over the pen. So now that I've kind of covered the blendability of the pen, the flexibility of the nib of the pen, the other thing you need to think about is also personal preference. Do you like a much thinner barrel? I find that the Crayolas have a very thin barrel, the Tombows are a little bit thicker, and the Aqua Pen Graphics are definitely more thicker pen barrel. And what I found is that I personally like the slightly thicker barrel. It makes a big difference for me long term as I'm working with the pen. I like the feeling of control. I really like the barrel. I actually did ask my husband to test these ones for me. So I've had the Tombows for a very long time. So I was trying to figure out, am I running into the new shiny syndrome? Oh, it's a new pen. It must be better than the ones I already have. So I actually asked him to test them out for me, and he really liked the Aqua Pen Graphics just for the bendability of the nib, and it was a little bit easier to control than the brush pens, and he also liked the feel of it in his hand. So depending if you like a chunkier pen, a very thin pen, that can also affect which pen you choose to buy. I feel like there's two things you want to think about when you are choosing a pen. One is the caps. Funny enough, what I found the difference between a lot of the really good quality markers and the cheaper markers that have dried out has been the caps themselves. I have these Marvy markers. I bought them, I probably had them for about 3 years, and then I had a set of 12, and this is the only one I have left. Well, the Tombos I've now had for closer to 15 years, the caps are good quality, they haven't dried out, they're still as good as probably the day that I got them. And so a lot of the art pens, really it comes down to the caps and how well these things are built to keep the ink inside, they'll prevent them from drying out. Another thing to think about is whether or not you're choosing a super cheap Crayola marker or an expensive art pen. You also need to realize that all of this ink that is water soluble is what's called fugitive, which means that it's going to fade over time if exposed to light. I use a lot of watercolor pens and paints in my creative practice, but a lot of that is in a journal. Usually if I am going to be using something on a canvas, I use acrylic paint just because it is not fugitive and it will last a lot longer than you will on an ink project. So one thing I would really like to suggest to you is don't go out and buy dozens of watercolor pens from a lot of different brands. A lot of them work very similarly, a lot of them are similar price points, some of them are cheaper, some of them are more expensive, but you don't need to buy every pen out there to end up with a beautiful set of watercolor pens. And I would also suggest buy what you can afford. So I was just researching a little bit this morning just to kind of give you some price points for things. And please realize this is all in Canadian dollars. So when I was looking at Crayolas this morning, you can get about a dozen of them for about $5. I have someone that I know who likes using the Mr. Sketch markers as her watercolor markers, and those are about $1 a piece. It's about $10 or $12 for 12 pens. Then you move to more expensive art pens like the Tombos and the Aquapen Graphics. And I find a lot of ones in these price points are usually between $2.50 to $3 a pen. And a lot of that is based off of getting them in a set. Really, any pen that you will buy individually, you generally end up paying more than you do when they are included in a set. I would really suggest stick with your budget. If you can only afford Crayola markers, buy Crayola markers, get creating, do fun things with them, and move up to something a little bit nicer as you can afford it. If you can afford a little bit more, I would buy a nicer pen. I would actually suggest going for a smaller set of pens that are a little bit higher quality over buying inexpensive pens because you'll grow into them, you'll be able to use them for a long time. And again, some of these markers are 15 years old. You don't have to replace them often, so putting a little bit more money up front to make sure you get good markers is not a bad way of going about it. The other thing you might want to think about is you may be looking at your set of colors and realizing that there's gaps. For example, the set of Aquapen Graphics, I have reds, but Tombow has a couple other reds that might be a better fit or might fill in the gap. So I would usually start with maybe a set of 24 colors and then add other brands in if you feel like, oh, there's a gap or there's a particular color that you like. That way you're not buying dozens and dozens of pens, or maybe what you do is you stick with something like Tombow that has 108 colors and you choose the colors that you want. There's a lot of different ways you can go about this. So much of this is personal preference. So I hope this is giving you some ideas on what to look for when you're choosing a pen for your creative practice. More than anything, I would suggest just choose something and start creating. Don't worry about getting the perfect pen and have that pull away from a chance for you to create something beautiful. So I hope this is giving you some ideas on what to look for when you're purchasing a watercolor pen, and I hope you found this video useful. And if you have, if you could like it, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on any future videos. I just want to say thanks again for your support. It means so much to me that you follow these videos every week. And if you have any questions about these pens, please leave a comment below. I would love to answer any questions that you might have. So I hope you have a really great week, that you take time for some personal self-care, and I will see you next time.